"He has your handwriting." The words, spoken by the school's headmistress, were a quiet pebble dropped into the vast, silent lake of Duke Alistair Blackwood's regret. He stood in the doorway of the modest classroom, a place he funded but had never bothered to visit in the 5 years since its inception. The air inside smelled of chalk dust, damp wool, and the sweet, cloying scent of boiled milk. It was a world away from the cold perfume and beeswax polish of his London townhouse, a world away from the echoing emptiness of Blackwood Manor. Alistair's gaze was fixed on a small boy at the front of the room. The child could be no older than 4, perhaps 5, with a head of unruly dark hair that defied the strict side parting it had been forced into. He was bent over a slate, his tongue poked out in concentration as he meticulously copied the day's letters. The boy was the best pupil, Mrs. Gable had explained with a proud whisper. A prodigy, she had called him. Bright, serious, and with a penmanship far beyond his years. It was true. The slant of the A, the confident loop of the G. It was a perfect, miniature replica of his own script, an idiosyncrasy of the wrist, a particular pressure on the downstroke that his tutors had despaired of ever correcting. It was as unique to the Blackwood line as the stormy gray of their eyes. And this boy, this charity school prodigy named Arthur Evesham, had those eyes. Alistair felt the air leave his lungs in a rush, as if he'd been struck. The room, with its rough-hewn benches and smudged windows, seemed to tilt on its axis. Mrs. Gable continued her quiet praise, oblivious to the cataclysm unfolding inside the Duke. He heard her words as if from a great distance. His mother, you see, a widow, such a dedicated woman, teaches him every evening. She works as a scribe herself, so I suppose it's no wonder. His mother, a widow, a scribe. The carefully constructed dam of apathy Alistair had built around his heart for 5 years did not just crack, it disintegrated. Water, cold and black and full of memory, rushed in, and he was drowning in it. Drowning in the scent of lemon verbena that always clung to her skin. Drowning in the ghost of her quiet laughter in the long gallery. Drowning in the venomous final words he had thrown at her in his cold, dark study. He had called her a disgrace, an adulteress. He had believed the lies, the forged letters, the carefully staged whispers of his cousin, Marcus. He had taken Marcus's poisoned word over the quiet dignity of the woman who wore his ring. And when she had vanished in the night, leaving behind every jewel, every silk dress, every trapping of the life he had given her, he had allowed his wounded pride to call it an admission of guilt. He had told himself it was relief he felt. It was a lie. What he had felt, what he had lived in for 5 hollow years, was a rot, an emptiness that the finest brandy and the most vapid company could not fill. The silence in his homes was no longer peaceful, but accusatory. Every ticking clock seemed to mark another moment of his failure. And here, in a dreary coastal town he'd only visited on a whim to inspect his charitable endeavors, was the consequence. Not a ghost, but a living, breathing boy with his own eyes and his own handwriting. A son, his son, and a mother, a widow named Evesham, Eleanor. The name was a shard of glass in his throat. He turned abruptly, his polished boots scuffing on the gritty floorboards. He managed a curt nod to the bewildered headmistress. "My thanks, Mrs. Gable. I have seen enough." He had seen everything, and he knew, with a certainty that was both terrifying and absolute, that his life of comfortable, desolate ignorance was over. The atonement was about to begin. 5 years earlier, the gilded cage of Blackwood Manor had been Eleanor's entire world. Its beauty was a subtle form of oppression. The air, heavy with the scent of hothouse lilies and old, oiled wood, felt too thick to breathe. Sunlight, filtered through panes of leaded glass, fell in weak, dusty columns, never quite managing to bring warmth to the cavernous rooms. The silence was the worst part. It was an active, malevolent presence, broken only by the funereal ticking of a dozen grandfather clocks, each one marking a slow, inexorable march towards nothing. Her marriage to Duke Alistair Blackwood was much the same, beautiful on the surface, but cold and airless within. He was not a cruel man, not in the way the gossip columns meant. He was simply absent, a handsome, powerful stranger with whom she shared a dining table and a last name. He moved through his life with an aristocratic detachment she found impossible to penetrate. His days were a fortress of meetings with his steward, sessions in Parliament, and long hours in his study. His nights were his own. She was another of his perfect possessions, like the matched set of thoroughbreds in his stable or the Ming vase in the entrance hall. To be admired, maintained, and largely ignored. Her only point of contact in this frozen world was, ironically, Alistair's cousin. Marcus Thorne was the Duke's private secretary, a man whose quiet efficiency made him indispensable. He was always there, a shadow at Alistair's elbow, with a deferential smile and watchful eyes. He was the one who brought her messages from her husband, who explained the Duke's schedule, who offered a sympathetic ear when her loneliness became a palpable ache. "His Grace is consumed by the new agricultural bill," Marcus would say, his voice a smooth balm. "He relies on you, you know. Your stability here allows him to focus on the great matters of the state." She had wanted to believe him. For a time she did. But a prickle of unease always followed his reassurances. It was in the way his gaze lingered a moment too long, the way he seemed to take a small, secret pleasure in her isolation. He was the gatekeeper, and he seemed to enjoy keeping the gate firmly shut. The unease began to curdle into something colder the day she found she was with child. It was a secret she held close, a tiny, flickering candle in the vast darkness of her life. She would tell Alistair that evening. Perhaps this news of an heir would finally be the key to unlocking the man she had married. Perhaps he would look at her, truly look at her for the first time. She waited for him in the drawing room, the fire casting dancing shadows on the wall. The clock on the mantelpiece chimed 10, then 11. He did not come. Just after midnight, Marcus appeared in the doorway. "My apologies, Your Grace," he said, his expression a perfect mask of regret. "The Duke has been unexpectedly detained. A late session. He asked me to convey his sincerest apologies." The lie was as smooth and polished as the marble floor. She had heard the carriage return an hour ago. She had heard the low murmur of voices from the study, Alistair's and Marcus's. A cold dread, sharp and acidic, washed over her. The small candle of hope inside her was extinguished. She was not just being ignored, she was being managed, handled, and Marcus was the one holding the reins. From that moment she saw him clearly, not as a helpful friend, but as a subtle poison, dripping into the ear of her husband, ensuring the chasm between them remained unbridgeable. The foreshadowing of her own destruction had begun, and she was powerless to stop it. The shattering came on a Tuesday. A day like any other, gray and damp, the sky the color of dishwater. Eleanor was arranging flowers in the morning room, the scent of roses thick in the air, when Alistair entered. It was unusual to see him at this hour, and the sight of him made her heart perform a nervous flutter. He was dressed not for Parliament or his club, but in a severe, dark coat, as if for a funeral. His face was a mask of stone. The usual cool detachment was gone, replaced by something frigid and dangerous. He did not greet her. He simply said, "My study. Now." The room was dark, the heavy velvet curtains drawn against the weak morning light. A single lamp on his desk cast a pool of gold onto a sheaf of letters scattered across the mahogany surface. Marcus stood by the fireplace, his expression one of grave sorrow, a pantomime of regret that made Eleanor's stomach clench. "What is this?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. Alistair didn't look at her. He stared at the letters as if they were venomous snakes. "I believe you know perfectly well what they are, madam." He pushed one forward. She recognized the stationery, It was hers. But the handwriting, a cruel, spidery imitation of her own, was not. The words were a vile collection of lovers' prose, addressed to a man she barely knew, a distant cousin she had danced with once, years ago. They spoke of secret meetings, of dissatisfaction with her marriage, of a love that was a betrayal to her husband. "This is not my writing," she said, the shock making her feel dizzy. "Alistair, this is a forgery." "A forgery?" He finally looked at her, and the ice in his eyes seared her. "And I suppose the testimony of the stable boy who saw you meet him in the West Woods is also a forgery. The gifts he sent, intercepted by Marcus before they could further disgrace my name." Marcus stepped forward, his face a study in pained loyalty. "Your Grace, I did not wish to believe it. I tried to find another explanation." "Enough," Alistair snapped, his voice cracking like a whip. He turned his full fury on Eleanor. "You have made a fool of me. You have brought shame to this house, to my name. You are a disgrace." The word hung in the air, a physical thing. Disgrace. It struck her with more force than a physical blow. Her mind went strangely blank. There was no screaming, no pleading, no torrent of tears. All the emotion inside her seemed to flash freeze, leaving behind a brittle, hollow shell. She felt a profound, acidic nausea rise in her throat. It was not the accusation that destroyed her. It was the chilling finality in his voice, the absolute certainty. He had weighed 5 years of her quiet, lonely dignity against the whispers of his cousin and a pile of crude forgeries, and she had been found wanting. He had never known her at all. She looked from Alistair's cold, unforgiving face to Marcus's mask of feigned sorrow, and saw the truth. This was not a misunderstanding. It was an execution, and her husband was the willing executioner. "I see," she said, her voice a dead, flat thing. That was all. She turned and walked out of the study, each step precise and measured. She did not look back. The moment of annihilation was complete. She was no longer the Duchess of Blackwood. She was nothing. And in that nothingness, a terrifying, crystalline clarity began to form. That night, the manor was a tomb, a silent, suffocating mausoleum filled with the ghosts of a life that had never truly been lived. Eleanor lay in her vast, cold bed, the fine linen sheets like a shroud. Sleep was an impossibility. Her mind, now shockingly clear after the initial frozen shock, was working with a cold, desperate pragmatism. She would not stay. She would not endure the public humiliation, the whispers, the sham of a life as the disgraced, sequestered Duchess. She would not allow her child, her tiny, secret anchor in this swirling vortex of betrayal, to be born into this house of lies, to be raised by a father who believed his mother a whore. The decision, once made, was a release. It was not an act of weakness or surrender. It was the first true act of self-preservation she had ever taken. She rose from the bed, moving with a silent, deliberate grace. She did not light a lamp. The moonlight filtering through the tall windows was enough. She walked to the enormous wardrobe, its dark wood gleaming, and opened it. Inside hung a fortune in silks, velvets, and brocades, gowns that had been the envy of the London season. She touched none of them. They were a costume for a role she no longer played. Instead, she went to a small chest in the corner, where she kept the few things that were truly hers from before her marriage. From within, she pulled a simple traveling dress of dark gray wool. It was sturdy, practical, and utterly anonymous. She changed into it, the rough fabric a shocking contrast to the soft silk of her nightgown. It felt like shedding a skin. Next, the jewels. The famous Blackwood diamonds lay cold and brilliant in their velvet box on her dressing table. A king's ransom. She closed the lid without a moment's hesitation. They were shackles, not adornments. She took only one thing, a small, plain gold locket that had belonged to her mother. Inside was a tiny painted miniature of her parents. It was the only piece of her past that mattered. From a hidden compartment in her writing desk, she retrieved a small leather pouch. It contained the pin money she had saved over the years, a modest sum by aristocratic standards, but a lifeline now. It was enough to buy a train ticket, to find a room, to survive for a few weeks until she could find work. She looked at herself in the grand, gilt-edged mirror. The woman looking back was a stranger. Her hair was down, unbound from its intricate coiffure. Her face was pale, her eyes wide and dark in the gloom. The Duchess was gone. In her place was a woman with nothing left to lose. One hand went to her still flat stomach, a fiercely protective gesture. "It will be just us," she whispered to the cavernous, empty room. "I will keep you safe." With one last look at the gilded cage that had been her prison, she slipped out of the room, down the servants' staircase, and through a small, forgotten door in the gardens. The night air was cold and damp, smelling of wet earth and freedom. She did not run. She walked, her back straight, away from the looming silhouette of Blackwood Manor, and did not once look back. The 5 years that followed were a crucible, forging a new woman from the ashes of the old. Eleanor became Mrs. Evesham, a quiet, respectable widow who arrived in the blustery coastal town of Seabrook with little more than a small trunk and a secret. The town, with its hardy fisherfolk and smattering of genteel society, was a world away from the intrigues of London. Here, a person was judged not by their title, but by the strength of their character and their willingness to work. She found a small, 2-room cottage at the edge of town, overlooking the churning gray sea. The rent was cheap, the roof leaked, and the wind howled through the ill-fitting window frames, but it was hers. It was a sanctuary. Survival was a harsh tutor. Her soft, aristocratic hands became chapped and calloused. She took in work, anything she could find, mending fine lace for the wife of the local solicitor, addressing invitations for the mayor's annual ball, and, most consistently, working as a scribe for a retired barrister who was slowly losing his sight. Her elegant, precise script became her most valuable commodity. 6 months after her arrival, Arthur was born. He was small but healthy, with a thatch of dark hair and a pair of startlingly familiar stormy gray eyes. He became the sun around which her entire universe revolved. Her poverty, her exhaustion, the constant, gnawing fear of being discovered, none of it mattered when she held him in her arms. He was her purpose. He was her vindication. She found an unlikely ally in Mrs. Gable, the stern but kind headmistress of the charity school Alastair's estate funded. Mrs. Gable saw in the reserved Mrs. Evesham a woman of education and quiet strength. She offered Eleanor small tasks at the school, mending books, helping the younger children with their letters, in exchange for a warm meal and a place for Arthur to play safely. Life was hard, but it was real. For the first time, Eleanor felt a sense of her own agency. She was no longer a duchess, a possession. She was a mother, a worker, a survivor. She had built this small, precarious life with her own 2 hands, and in the quiet solitude of her cottage, with the sound of the sea as her constant companion and her son sleeping soundly in his cot, she found a hard-won, fragile peace. Meanwhile, in the echoing halls of Blackwood Manor, Alastair was living in a different kind of poverty, a spiritual desolation that no amount of wealth could alleviate. The first year after Eleanor's departure had been fueled by a righteous, wounded pride. Marcus had been masterful in stoking the flames, ensuring Alastair saw Eleanor's flight as the ultimate proof of her guilt. But pride is a poor companion. The silence she left behind was not peaceful. It was a deafening void. The manor felt dead. Her scent faded from the rooms. Her quiet presence was gone from the breakfast table. Alastair found himself wandering the halls at night, inexplicably drawn to her empty rooms, feeling like a trespasser in his own life. Marcus, ever present, tried to fill the void. He arranged parties, introduced Alistair to eligible young debutantes, managed the estate with his usual chilling efficiency. But it was all hollow. The laughter at his dinner parties sounded brittle and false. The flirtations of the young ladies were cloying. He had everything a man of his station could desire, and he had never felt more empty. The rot of regret began to set in slowly. It started as a small, niggling doubt, a memory of Eleanor's face in the study, not guilty, but shattered. The way she had said, "I see," with a finality that had haunted him. He began to look at Marcus, truly look at him, and see not a loyal cousin, but a man who had profited immensely from Eleanor's absence. Marcus now had the Duke's complete trust, unchecked power over his affairs, and a permanent place at the head of his household. The catalyst for his investigation was a mundane thing. While sorting through old papers, Alistair came across one of the forged letters. He had kept them, locked away, a morbid reminder of his wife's betrayal. This time he noticed something he'd missed in his rage. The forger had used a particular phrase, "my heart's own despair," a piece of overwrought prose that Eleanor, with her precise and unadorned style, would never have written. Then he remembered. It was a phrase from a rather terrible book of poetry Marcus had been fond of quoting that year. It was a tiny thread, but Alistair pulled it. He bypassed Marcus entirely and secretly hired Mr. Finch, a discreet and ruthlessly thorough investigator his father had once employed. He didn't tell Finch what to look for. He simply asked him to reconstruct the events of the weeks leading up to his wife's departure, with a particular focus on the activities of Marcus Thorne. The first report came a month later. It detailed Marcus's secret meetings with a known forger in a dingy London pub. The second report identified the stable boy who had given false testimony. He had been paid a handsome sum and had since disappeared. The third, and most damning, traced Marcus's finances, revealing a series of large, unexplained payments, blackmail, hush money, payoffs. The truth, when it was finally laid bare, was a monstrous, suffocating thing. It was not just that Eleanor was innocent. It was that he, Alistair, had been a fool. A proud, blind, arrogant fool, so easily manipulated, so quick to believe the worst. He had not been a husband. He had been a judge and a jailer, and he had condemned an innocent woman. The weight of his failure was crushing. The emptiness he had been living in was not a void left by her. It was the hollow space where his own honor should have been. Finch's final report was a simple one. It contained an address, a cottage in a town called Seabrook. He had found her. Alistair rode for 2 days, pushing his horse to its limit. He did not take the ducal carriage. He did not want the comfort or the ceremony. This was not a duke visiting his estates. This was a man going to face his sins. He arrived in Seabrook at dusk, coated in the dust of the road, his face grim. The town was small, smelling of salt and fish. It felt like the edge of the world. He found her the next morning in the market square. She was bargaining for fish, a woven basket on her arm. The change in her was staggering. The ethereal, fragile duchess was gone. This woman was honed, sharpened by hardship. Her simple wool dress was worn but clean. Her hands, resting on the stall, were not the soft, pale hands he remembered. They were capable, chapped from work. There were fine lines of weariness around her eyes, but her spine was ramrod straight. She looked formidable, and when she smiled briefly at the fishmonger, it was a small, genuine thing that pierced Alistair's heart with a pain sharper than any he had ever known. He followed her at a distance, a ghost haunting the edges of her new life. He watched her stop at the bakery, her interactions with the townspeople easy and respectful. They knew her here. She belonged here. He was the intruder. His path led him to the charity school. He saw her through the window, helping a small girl with her sums. And then he saw the boy, Arthur. He watched, rooted to the spot, as the child practiced his letters on a slate, his small face a mask of concentration. Then the boy looked up, his gaze sweeping the schoolyard, and his eyes met Alistair's through the glass. They were his eyes, the same stormy gray, the same shape. It was like looking at a portrait of himself as a child. The world narrowed to that single, shocking point of connection. A son. He had a son. He stumbled back from the window, his breath catching in his chest. He leaned against the cold stone wall of the school, the rough texture biting into his palm. The sight of the boy, the truth of him, was a physical blow. It was the culmination of all his failures, the living, breathing embodiment of everything he had thrown away. The handwriting on the slate, the shared eyes, it was undeniable. He waited until evening. He saw the lamps being lit in her small cottage, a beacon of warmth against the encroaching twilight. He walked to the door, his heart a frantic drum against his ribs. For the first time in his adult life, the powerful, confident Duke of Blackwood was terrified. He raised his hand and knocked. The door opened. Eleanor stood there, a shawl wrapped around her shoulders. Her eyes widened, first in disbelief, then in a cold, shuddered fury. All the warmth he had seen in her earlier was gone, replaced by a glacial wall of ice. "You," she said. The word was not a question, but an accusation. "Eleanor," he breathed, the name aching in his chest. "It is Mrs. Evesham," she corrected him, her voice sharp and brittle. "And you are trespassing. What do you want?" Behind her, a small voice piped up. "Mama, who is it?" Arthur appeared at her side, clutching her skirts, his gray eyes wide with curiosity as he stared up at the tall stranger. Alistair's gaze dropped to the boy, and his carefully prepared words, his apologies, his explanations, they all died in his throat. He could only stare. Eleanor's body went rigid. She moved instinctively, shielding Arthur partly behind her, a lioness protecting her cub. The gesture was more damning than any words she could have spoken. "You will leave," she said, her voice low and trembling with a rage that was 5 years in the making. "You will leave this town and you will not come back. You have no right to be here. You have no right to look at him." "He is my son," Alistair managed to say, the words raw and clumsy. A bitter, humorless laugh escaped her. "He is my son. I am the one who carried him, who bore him, who has fed and clothed him and kept him safe for 5 years. You were busy believing lies and wallowing in your pride. You forfeited any right to him, and to me, a long time ago. Now, for the last time, leave." The confrontation in the doorway was only the first salvo. She did not want to hear his explanations. When he tried to speak of Marcus, of the forgeries, of the vast and terrible conspiracy that had destroyed their lives, she held up a hand, stopping him cold. "It does not matter," she said, her voice devoid of all emotion. "It does not matter if 1,000 men lied. It only matters that you, my husband, believed them. You looked at me, the woman who shared your bed and your name, and you saw a stranger and a whore. That is the only truth I need. Your credulity was the betrayal, Alistair. The rest is just noise." She called him Alistair, not Your Grace. The name, stripped of its title, was more intimate, and therefore more wounding than the formal address. It was a reminder of a man he should have been, a husband he had failed to be. He tried to give her a purse heavy with gold. "For the boy," he said, his voice hoarse. "For his needs." She looked at the purse in his hand as if it were a coiled snake. "He needs nothing from you. We have provided for ourselves. We do not want your money. It is 5 years too late for that." She closed the door in his face. The final, definitive click of the latch echoed in the quiet street. He was left standing on the cobblestones, the cold sea air biting at his face, utterly and completely alone. But he did not leave. The next day, the town of Seabrook awoke to a delicious new piece of gossip. The Duke of Blackwood, one of the wealthiest and most powerful men in England, had taken up residence in old Tom Paskin's fishing cottage, a dilapidated shack at the far end of the beach that had been empty for years. It was a hovel with a leaky roof, salt-caked windows, and the lingering, permanent smell of fish. Alistair paid the owner an exorbitant sum for a year's lease. He bought a simple mattress, a cookpot, and a sack of coal from the local merchants. He endured the shocked stares, the whispered speculation. He chopped his own wood, his hands, accustomed to holding nothing heavier than a pen or the reins of a pampered horse, quickly blistering and then hardening. He learned to cook passable, if grim, meals over a small, smoky fire. He was performing his penance. He knew that grand gestures and ducal commands would mean nothing to Eleanor. Words were meaningless. He had already proven how hollow his could be. Only action, consistent and humble, had any chance of penetrating the fortress she had built around her heart. He would not intrude. He would not force his presence on her. But he would be there, a constant, quiet, enduring presence on the periphery of her life. His first move was to bring the truth to her, whether she wanted to hear it or not. He sent a message to his investigator, Finch. Within a week, a carriage arrived in Seabrook, carrying two nervous, shabbily dressed men. One was the forger, the other was the stable boy who had been paid to lie. Alistair did not summon Eleanor. He arranged for the men to give their sworn depositions before the local magistrate, a stern, unflappable man named Mr. Davies. He then sent a simple, formal note to Eleanor, delivered by the magistrate's clerk. It was not a request. It was an invitation to hear testimony regarding a conspiracy against her person. She came. She stood at the back of the magistrate's small, stuffy office, her face pale but composed, her arms crossed over her chest. Alistair stood on the opposite side of the room, watching her, not the witnesses. He watched as she listened to the forger describe in detail how Marcus Thorne had provided him with samples of her handwriting, how he had dictated the vile contents of the letters. He watched her face as the former stable boy, now a guilt-ridden man, confessed to the lies he had told for 50 sovereigns. Her expression did not change, but Alistair saw the slight tightening of her hands, the almost imperceptible straightening of her spine. She was hearing the mechanics of her own destruction, the cold, sordid details of how her life had been dismantled, piece by piece. The evidence was irrefutable. It was one thing to suspect a lie. It was another to hear its architects confess. When it was over, she simply nodded to the magistrate and left without a word to Alistair. It was not forgiveness, not even a thaw, but it was a crack in the ice. She now knew the truth, proven by an impartial third party. His small acts of service began. He noticed the woodpile outside her cottage was low. The next morning, a neatly stacked cord of seasoned oak appeared on her doorstep before dawn. He learned from Mrs. Gable that the school's roof leaked terribly. A team of the finest roofers from the county arrived a few days later, sent by an anonymous benefactor. When a sickness swept through the town's children, he used his name and fortune to bring a renowned physician from London to Seabrook, who treated every family, rich or poor, free of charge. He never claimed credit. He never approached her. He simply saw a need and filled it. He began spending his afternoons at the school, not as a duke, but as a volunteer. He read stories to the children, his deep voice captivating them. He helped them with their sums. And he spent time with Arthur. It was a delicate, careful courtship of his own son. He did not push. He answered the boy's endless, curious questions. He showed him how to skip stones on the flat gray water. He discovered the boy had a fascination with maps, and he procured old nautical charts of the coastline for him. Arthur, with the simple, accepting heart of a child, began to look for the tall, sad man he called Mr. Alistair. Eleanor watched from a distance, her expression unreadable. She did not encourage it, but crucially, she did not stop it. After a month of this quiet siege, Alistair knew he had to deal with the source of the poison. He left Seabrook for London, sending Eleanor a short note beforehand. "I am going to finish this. I will be back in a week." He did not confront Marcus in private. He did it publicly, in the reading room of White's, the most exclusive gentlemen's club in London. In front of 24 lords, earls, and cabinet ministers, Alistair laid out the sworn depositions. He spoke in a cold, clear voice, detailing his cousin's years-long campaign of lies, forgery, and betrayal, all for the chance to be next in line to the Blackwood title and fortune. The room fell into a stunned silence. Marcus, who had been holding court by the fireplace, turned a ghastly shade of white. His carefully constructed world of influence and respectability crumbled into dust in the space of 5 minutes. He was ruined. Socially, financially, legally. He fled the club, and by the next day had fled the country, a disgraced exile. Alistair returned to Seabrook, not in triumph, but in exhaustion. He had cleared Eleanor's name. He had destroyed the man who had wronged her. He had done everything he could to prove the truth. But he knew with a certainty that chilled him to the bone that the final judgment still rested with her. He had laid the foundation, but only she could decide if anything could be built upon it. The thaw came, as it so often does, not with a grand gesture, but in a moment of crisis. A winter storm blew in from the sea, a vicious, howling thing that rattled the cottages and sent waves crashing over the seawall. In the midst of it, Arthur fell ill. It began as a cough, but quickly deepened into a fever that left him delirious and struggling for breath. The local doctor was stranded in the next town by a washed-out road. Eleanor, frantic with worry, tried every remedy she knew, but the boy's fever continued to climb. She was alone, terrified, and for the first time in 5 years, her resilience began to fray. As if sensing her despair, there was a knock on the door. It was Alistair. He was soaked through, his hair plastered to his head, his face etched with concern. "Mrs. Gable sent for me," he said simply, stepping inside without waiting for an invitation. He took one look at the feverish boy in the small cot and took charge, not as a duke giving orders, but as a father. "We need to bring the fever down," he said, his voice calm and steady, a rock in the chaos of her fear. "Keep bathing his forehead with cool water. I will hold him." And so they began their vigil. Through the long, dark night, with the storm raging outside, they sat together by Arthur's bedside. Alistair held his son, murmuring nonsense words of comfort, his large, strong frame a bastion against the illness. Eleanor moved back and forth, fetching cool cloths, whispering reassurances, her hand resting on Arthur's hot forehead. In the shared, primal fear for their child, the walls between them dissolved. They were not a duke and a wronged wife. They were simply a mother and a father, united in a single, desperate purpose. They spoke in low whispers, not of the past, not of betrayal or forgiveness, but of Arthur, of his first word, of his love for ships, of the funny way he wrinkled his nose when he was concentrating. For the first time, they were a team. Towards dawn, the fever broke. Arthur's breathing eased, and he fell into a deep, natural sleep. The storm outside had passed, leaving behind a world washed clean and quiet. Eleanor and Alistair sat in exhausted silence, watching their sleeping son. The gray morning light filled the small room, illuminating the weariness on their faces. Eleanor spoke first, her voice rough with fatigue. "Thank you." "There is no need," he replied, his gaze still fixed on Arthur. "He is my son." He said it not as a claim, but as a simple statement of fact, a truth that had been forged in the crucible of the night. A few days later, after Arthur was fully recovered and chasing seagulls on the beach again, Eleanor walked to the fisherman's cottage. Alistair was outside, mending a fishing net with clumsy, unpracticed hands. He looked up as she approached, his expression cautious, hopeful. She stopped a few feet from him. "I have been thinking," she began, her voice clear and steady, "about what you have done, proving the truth, helping the town, being a father to Arthur. He waited, not daring to breathe. "I do not forgive you for the past," she said, and his heart sank. "The man who sent me away in disgrace, I do not know if I can ever truly forgive him. But he is not the man standing in front of me now. I see that." She took a deep breath. "I am willing to try again, Alistair. Not as your Duchess, a possession to be displayed and discarded, but as your wife, your partner. We will return to Blackwood, but on new terms. My terms." It was more than he had dared to hope for. It was everything. He did not move to touch her. He simply nodded, his throat too tight for words. The look in his eyes was one of profound, humbling gratitude. It was not a victory. It was a reprieve, a chance, earned through patience and penance, to build something new from the wreckage of the old. Returning to Blackwood Manor was like stepping into a dream. The house was the same grand portraits on the walls, the same scent of polish and lilies, the same clocks ticking in the halls, but the people within it were irrevocably changed. The silence was the first thing to go. It was replaced by the sound of a child's laughter echoing in the long gallery, the patter of small feet on the marble floors. Arthur, the secret heir, had come home, and he filled the cavernous spaces with a life they had never known. The power dynamic shifted immediately. Eleanor was no longer the passive duchess. She took an active, authoritative role in the management of the estates. She had spent 5 years managing a household on a pittance. She knew the value of every penny. She reviewed the ledgers. She spoke with the tenant farmers. She learned every inch of the land that was now hers to command. Her focus was not on profit, but on welfare. She established a proper school on the estate itself, modeled after Mrs. Gable's, ensuring the children of the tenants had the same opportunities her son had received. She improved the cottages, ensuring they were warm and dry. Alistair did not interfere. He supported her, championed her, and deferred to her judgment in all things related to the domestic running of the estate. He had seen what she could build from nothing. He was content to be the provider of the resources she needed to build something better for them all. His domain became the political one. He used his seat in the House of Lords to advocate for educational reforms, for the funding of charity schools across the country, becoming a surprisingly passionate voice for the dispossessed. He had seen firsthand how a lack of opportunity could be a prison, and how a little help could be a lifeline. Their marriage was a quiet, careful reconstruction. The passion and fury of their youth were gone, replaced by something deeper and more resilient. It was built on a foundation of shared purpose, mutual respect, and the fierce, unifying love they both had for their son. Intimacy returned slowly, tentatively. It was not born of duty or expectation, but of quiet moments, a shared glance over Arthur's head at the dinner table, a hand brushing against another's as they walked in the gardens, a conversation that stretched late into the night. One cool autumn evening, a year after their return, they were standing on the terrace overlooking the gardens. It was a place Eleanor had once hated, a symbol of her beautiful prison. Now, bathed in the soft, golden light of sunset, it felt different. Arthur was on the lawn below, chasing after a ball with a new puppy, his joyous shrieks carrying on the still air. "He is happy here," Alistair said quietly, standing beside her. "We are all happy here," Eleanor replied, and the simple truth of the statement settled between them, comfortable and warm. He reached out and took her hand. His was no longer the soft hand of a detached aristocrat. It was calloused from his time in Seabrook, a tangible reminder of his penance. She laced her fingers through his. "I never thanked you, Eleanor," he said, his voice low. She turned to him, a question in her eyes. "For what?" "For surviving," he said, his gray eyes, so like their son's, filled with an emotion she had never seen in him before, a profound, humble awe. "You did not need me to rescue you. You rescued yourself. You rescued our son. All I did was finally open my eyes and find my way back to the home you had already built." In that moment, the last vestiges of the old hurt finally fell away. She saw him not as the Duke, not as her betrayer or her savior, but as Alistair, her husband, her partner, the man who had journeyed through the wilderness of his own making to find his way back to her. She leaned her head against his shoulder, and together they watched their son play as the sun set on Blackwood Manor. The gilded cage had, at long last, become a home. The air was no longer thick with silence and unspoken grief, but filled with the promise of a future they would build together, on their own terms.